Hi, my name's Rachel Saunders and welcome to this episode of the Temporal Hospitality podcast. As ever, if you like what you are seeing, the subscribe and like button are below. And for the full transcript with all the sources, please check out the links below. This is a deep dive into the dark history of the UK's anti-gay legislation and policies that for 82 years completely criminalised any form of intimacy between men. The thoughts and opinions given by the writers reflect their personal attitudes and those of their times. Please note that this contains language and attitudes which may cause offence or be upsetting. My intent is to show the true dark of those times while bringing forth the light shining from within those who suffered in it. Dining with Virginia at Richmond, she is delicious as ever. How right she is when she says when love makes everyone a bore, but the excitement in life lies in the little moves nearer to people. Vita Sackville West wrote this in February 1923, as the flames of romance begin to blossom between her and Virginia Woolf. Their love stood in contrast to the mores of the time. From the moment the UK's 1885 Labouchere Amendment was passed, male gay sex and any form of intimacy was punitively punished until the passing 1967 Sexual Offences Act. Homosexuality was outlawed, and anyone not heterosexual and married was forced socially to hide their love and make do with illegal trysts. The little moves nearer to people could well end up with time served in Reading jail or worse. As the world teeters on new anti-LGBTQI+ oppression, here I explore a world where the freedom to love and express that love was both illegal and hidden, where to be yourself was kept to the shadows and long night. Britain prior to 1967 persecuted gay men harshly while erasing lesbian women, trans people and any other sexual identity which went against normative understanding. This was not some golden age, nor was it a place of plucky gay men fighting the good fight. It was a place of deep fears, blackmail and worse. As the Times pointed out in 1958, the anti-male homosexuality laws were unjust and obsolete, especially as society refused to punish lesbian practices. British law was a two-tier justice system, with social mores barely shifting over those 82 years. Looking back on his time in the 1920s, Christopher Isherwood reflected, "There is only one sin, disobedience to the inner law of our own nature. This disobedience is a fault of those who teach us, as children, to control God, our desires, instead of giving him room to grow. The whole problem is to find out which is God and which is the devil." This dichotomy between the socially constructed sense of what ought to be and the desires one felt innately cut to the heart of sexuality in the long black night between 1885 and 1967. For some, being free to love and experience life based on your own desires unleashed the devil in society, to be cast out and branded a social pariah. And for others, it was a lifetime hidden away and forced to be discreet. What is telling as I went through the newspaper archives, biographies and novels for this was the fear which permeated British queer society during this time. Queerness was never viewed as socially acceptable. Indeed, as I will narrate, gay men and lesbians were viewed as predators, immoral, and the lowest criminals in need of medical intervention. This history has not fully been put squarely in the past, as queerness and transness are still targeted using the same demeaning and derogatory language echoing from this period. What is missing are the everyday voices of queer men and women from this period, as the only surviving narratives are those from the likes of Quentin Crisp and Virginia Woolf, who either had money and privilege to promote their work, or were unbowed survivors unafraid to publicly out themselves. The vast majority of men prosecuted for being homosexual during this period suffered in shamed silence, their voices lost to history. Barry Ray suggests that the most useful sexual histories are those that provide depth of context without assuming sexual identities or anticipating complete absence, as there are limitations in thinking of a unitary homosexuality rather than overlapping, contradictory and conflicted accounts. Queer history is uneven, contested and historiographically, where linear attempts based on modern understanding can smooth the creases and often remove complexities in shifting readings. Emma Vickers adds to this by pointing out that much of this period has slipped from memory into history, and there is an urgency in remembering and bringing to light the love, hope, tenacity and bravery of those who lived during that long night of homosexual prohibition. Up until the 1960s, study of sexuality was primarily the realm of biologists and psychologists, and the notion that sexuality has a history was regarded as absurd. Yet, as Sean Brady outlines, history studies have demonstrated that homosexuality is a mutable category, far from being fixed and determined, changes over space and time. It is historically and culturally specific. Attitudes queer people have changing from society to society and in different historical periods and contexts. The very notion of lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender are perpetually being refined and redefined as successive writers, thinkers and lived experiences evolve and subvert the terms. Indeed, as any history of non-heteronormative lives involve a degree of personal contextualization and projection onto those lives. For example, the genealogy of male homosexuality consists of the 5 categories of femacy, sodomy, friendship, inversion, and homosexuality itself. For this reason, any attempt at imposing modern values onto the past or using the past to validate conservative conceptions of sexuality are tinged with ideology and personal bias. Lesbian women had vastly different experiences to homosexual men, so untangling this from a distance of 70 or more years requires contextualization and awareness that we can never inhabit their lives and loves. This is therefore an incomplete narrative, a broad brushstroke of love and terror, of police baiting gay men, of passionate romances and sordid backstreet sex, surviving the dark night of queer oppression to courage, boldness and a willingness to step outside social expectations. Dark night of the soul. Henry Labouchere was a strong opponent to homosexuality. Buggery was already illegal, punishable with a life term, as indeed was any indecent assault upon a male person, by the terms of an 1861 Act. On a dark night in 1885, Labouchere tabled an amendment to the Criminal Law Amendment Act, adding Section 11, which stated, "Any male person who in public or private commits or are a party to the commission of or procured or attempt to procure the commission by any male person of any act of gross indecency with another male person shall be guilty of a misdemeanour." Only a few British MPs were present in the House that evening, and with its passing, the long dark night for British gay men began. The vagueness of Labouchere's amendment about what constituted gross indecency, and the silence of proof required, led to a big rise in the number of prosecutions, and the amendment became a blackmailed charter. William Mafiz outlines that the amendment took 4 minutes of debate time. Such was a consensus condemning homosexuality in British society, and there was no discussion by MPs. Homosexuality was widely viewed as sinful, perverse, and unnatural in Victorian society, and the fact the term gross indecency was never legally defined at law allowed police and judges wide latitude in how they enforced it. While there are estimates of around 40,000 men being prosecuted under Section 11, the actual number is hard to establish given the nature of English court records across the period. What is telling when you read through the histories and newspapers of the period is the lack of queer voices able to tell their own lives and loves on their own terms. What diaries and literature survive come from middle-class intellectual framing, so the working class and provincial perspectives are almost non-existent. This makes tracing the actual lives of queer folk post-1885 a matter of tracing scandal, court cases and literary fiction. Oscar and the fallout which followed him. Let us start at the Albemarle Club on the evening of February 18th, 1895. Lord Queensberry leaves the card reading, "For Oscar Wilde, posing as a sodomite." It was a serious social accusation with injurious implication for Wilde's reputation and the position of everyone connected with him. He sued for malicious and defamatory libel, yet, at the Old Bailey a few months later, Sir Edward Carson is brutally cross-examining Oscar. Carson repeatedly digs at Wilde's improprieties, including with young men, with Carson's distaste in part flowing from his feeling Wilde has betrayed his own social class. Wilde was found guilty of gross indecency, was sentenced to 2 years in prison, and on release fled into exile, where he died in poverty in 1900, aged 46. When considering the dark night of queer sexuality in Britain, class, race and sex all clashed in a milieu of law and lawlessness, where those with money, connections and wit could avoid the worst of it. Yet, as will become clear, if the British legal system had it in for you, no matter what your station in life, if you were homosexual or lesbian, the state always had ways of making you suffer. Post-1885, the legal landscape was vastly different for men who loved and had sex with other men and women who loved other women and had sex with other women. Britain was a colonial empire at the height of its power, where heteronormative lives were expected of all, and any discovered intimacy between men could result in personal scandal and legal consequences. Unless a woman inherited wealth or had obliging parents, she was expected to get married, have children, and only have access to less social status jobs. Until the outbreak of war in 1914, women were forced out of the workplace upon marriage, could not vote, and were rigidly socially controlled. The very concept of female same-sex love and sex was forbidden and unacknowledged concept. Following Wilde's conviction, many English homosexuals had fled to France for fear of being persecuted and prosecuted. Further Edwardian sentiments around homosexuals can be found in examples such as the Colonial Office's 1907 report of a committee of inquiry into allegations of unnatural offences against native coal miners, which drew out the desire for imposing British mores on colonial subjects. The repression that marred any gay life in Britain was entrenched and endemic. Yet, as Justin Gowers discusses in his championing of John Betjeman as a gay icon, it was a mistreatment of Wilde by the authorities that spurred Betjeman on to write some of his greatest poems. Betjeman and other writers found ways to explore queerness and push back against the repression. This is why literature and history are so entwined over this period, as it allowed freer expression to explore the boundaries, though not without its own kind of pushback. Other men who desired other men post-1885 began to try to justify their own desires, seeking to develop the notion of a homosexual identity. This period also saw the Greek island of Lesbos begin to be associated with sapphic desire, first as male fantasy, and then in the coining of lesbian to describe women who desired other women. This was a period of classification, studying, and boundary setting of who was and was not part of the natural order of things. Life at the end of the Edwardian summer. Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson's 1896 book, The Greek View of Life, explores the boundaries around talking about homosexuality and male fraternal love were not as buttoned up as the previous year's trials might have us assume. He outlines the Platonic conception of woman being regarded as a means, not an end, and was treated in a manner constant with this view. He shows a contrast between Grecian understanding of women and the late Victorian mores was how openly the elite slept with their mistresses. In section 10, he lays out the special friendship between men, laying out the case for defence of men on men love, for the special friendships as they would later come to be known. Without using any Uranian, invert or homosexual language, he laid out what he perceived as a natural order of Greek living, paving the way for future writers to engage with non-heteronormative lives without breaching social mores. There was an uneasy relationship between the early discipline of sex psychology, and while in the 21st century the pathologization of same-sex desire is viewed as a preservative of charlatans, in Europe prior to the Great War, this pathologizing was a power and institutionalized form of prejudice until the 1970s. The jumble of sexuality, psychiatry and morality created a febrile atmosphere where quasi-medical attempts at understanding queerness. This shows through in newspapers, parliamentary debates and court records across the period covered. Edward Carpenter's 1908 The Intermediate Sex argued that the subtleties of human sexuality cannot be dismissed as either good or bad, that queer people can be born beautiful examples of humanity and others perverse and tangled ruins. He hoped that Earnings, queer folk, would have much to teach society about love and life, as a great deal of misunderstanding had been caused by societal oppression. Carpenter explicitly called out that queer people were not some rare breed, and that queer people in his time were forced to marry and have children, which neither raised their desire or solved the problem. Yet Carpenter's understanding is limited to his own personal observations, falling back onto stereotypes to reinforce his arguments. He draws out the illicit nature of queer affairs of the heart, showing that while they are natural impulses, it is societal expectations which cause harm. As Damien Rouse outlines, Carpenter was a pioneering gay man who built a life for himself and his male gay lover from the slings and arrows of society. Through his writings, sought to emancipate gay men from the cruelties of British law. Howard Booth outlines how T.H. Lawrence's writings in the 1910s were subconsciously queer, drawing from the biblical tradition of David and Jonathan rather than an explicitly queer English canon. Yet, as Booth explains, Lawrence had a complex relationship with sexuality, as after the Oscar Wilde trial, homosexuality and lesbian lives were shoved firmly back into the closet. Lawrence's letters draw upon two arguments against homosexual desire: a supposed self-engagement and perceived link to disillusion and decay. Jean Kennard draws out Virginia Woolf's own ambiguous relationship with male homosexuality, showing that initially she viewed it as anti-feminist and patriarchal, to one of fellow outsiders, pacifist and empathetic with women, just before her death in 1941. Much of the misogyny Woolf and others observed within their sexually ambiguous social set deprived women of the opportunity to succeed, which shows the overlapping layers of patriarchy and power even within the sexually marginalised. For lesbians, things were more socially complex. Vera Home, Jack, and Evelina Haverfield, Eve, the relationship started at the height of the suffragette movement in 1909. Refusing to compromise on their sexuality and determined to be themselves in conservative Edwardian Britain. They were at the forefront of showing what a modern lesbian relationship could look like in 1911, riding together, wearing men's clothes, and showing that they belonged in society. They are a core part of the broader struggle for women's emancipation in British society, with Jack working closely with the Pankhursts, including standing trial in 1909 in a historic case. The Edwardian summer was shattered when war broke out in 1914. Millions of British soldiers served in the military, including gay men and lesbians working in the auxiliary forces. Gay war poets Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen had a complex relationship with the war. Sassoon won the Military Cross for bravery, though by 1917 he had publicly spoken out against the war. In the summer of 1917, he was declared unfit for service due to his public statements and confined to a hospital for treatment. There he met Wilfred Owen, and the two soon developed a working relationship which produced the most impactful war poetry of the Great War. Sassoon never shirked his sexuality, and when his former lover was killed in March 1916, he wrote The Last Meeting, which spoke of his feelings towards him. I called him once, then listened. Nothing moved. Only my thumping heart beat out the time. Whispering his name, I groped from room to room. Quite empty was that house. I could not hold his human ghost, remembered in the love that strove in vain to be companion still. Both men put pay to the lie that homosexuals were weak, lazy, and a social menace. Owen was killed in the last days of the war in 1918. Sassoon died of cancer in 1967, in time to see some homosexual emancipation. Director Terence Davis stated that Sassoon was known by everybody in the world, went everywhere, and had a huge life which included being gay, getting married, and being a Catholic. Sassoon lived, loved, and wrote. Hazy interwar days. Jack and Eva's complex relationship was shattered by Eve's death from influenza in 1919. Their war had been spent helping Serbia in the Balkans, and post-war they and newfound friends helped orphans. Eve's death brought about a great grief in Jack, though over the next year she grew close to Margaret Greenlees, who she called Curly. By 1921, they had become a couple, and until Curly's death in 1952, the two remained devoted to each other. For 3 decades, they took part in British society, travelled widely, and never shied from being public with their relationship. In contrast, the complexities of human sexuality came in the view of barbed wire disease, where British male prisoners of war were engaging in homosexual acts and relationships while interned. Matthew Stibb points out the complexities of interrogating the mental health of those behind barbed wire, especially relying on the work of sexologists and psychologists who framed homosexuality as a pathogen. Mary Stopes shows the prevailing attitude in 1921, in which he complained that men were becoming weak, undersexed, overneurotic, a copy of the homosexual ideal. She wanted men to be manly men and women to be truly feminine creatures who were strongly sexed. Her words echoed the prevailing attitudes, though as gay policeman Harry Daly outlined in his autobiography, things were much more complex due to class, employment, and the opportunities one had. Vita and Virginia were complete opposites. Vita, a vivacious, rich, big-hearted lover, Virginia, an intellectual bohemian who could cut you down with her words. Though the relationship was over by 1927, the two remained lifelong friends, with Vita's son Nigel commenting that Virginia's book, Orlando, was the greatest love letter in literature. Queerness oozed from the middle-class Bloomsbury set, their writings and lifestyles, yet in the rest of Britain queerness was viewed with hostility. As Kennard highlights, Woolf never quite confirms her own sexuality, though she is clearly comfortable initiating sapphic relationships, who stood up for women who were treated as second-class citizens at universities such as Cambridge. Dickinson Goldworthy Lowe's death in 1932 saw his Cambridge academic career eulogised, while his queer sexuality was downplayed based on the feelings of his biographer. To be queer, not heterosexual, in this period was to face a world of oppressive heteronormativity. The Doctor asks the protagonist in Nightwood about newfound forbidden love. You have never loved anyone before, and you'll never love anyone again, as you love Robin. Very well. What is this love you have for the invert, boy or girl? It is what they who were spoken of in every romance we have ever read. It was scandalous, even in fiction. And now Mary needs no longer sigh with unrest, need no longer lay her cheek against Stephen's shoulder, for her rightful place was in Stephen's arms, and there she would be, overwhelmed by the peace that comes at such times for all happy lovers. Radcliffe Hall's subversive lesbian text, The Well of Loneliness, was banned for obscenity when it was published in 1928. Highlighting that while being a lesbian was not illegal under UK law, the implications and social impropriety associated with such behaviour were dealt with harshly by the authorities. Magistrate Byron, who passed down a destruction order on imported copies of the book, declared, "The mere fact that the book dealt with unnatural offences between women would not in itself make it obscene libel, but in the present case there was not one word which suggested that anyone with the horrible tendencies described was in the least degree blameworthy." Byron reflected the mores of the time, seeing lesbians as perversion on the natural order. Hall, herself a staunch Catholic, was proud indeed to have taken up my pen in defence of those who were utterly defenceless. Sexual inverts. The novel was a stylisation of Hall's own experiences and acquaintances. At the age of 17, she began enjoying what proper Brits considered a truly unspeakable vice. She immersed herself in back-to-back love affairs with other women, relationships she found emotionally and sexually gratifying. In 1921, although still enamoured with an ex-older lover, Hall began living with her new lover, Una Trowbridge, who was to remain by her side for the rest of her life. In The Well of Loneliness, Hall writes through her central character of the high cost of same-sex love, while, at the same time, denouncing the hypocrisy of heterosexual society. T.H. Lawrence's 1910s writing had a fluctuating and unstable response to homosexual desire. Female writers such as Hall, Barnes, Woolf and Sackville West belonged to a burgeoning group of middle-class creatives who challenged social assumptions after the Great War in 1918, with the concepts of sexuality and gender challenged as old Edwardian mores were challenged and redefined. The well of loneliness was, in effect, a plea not only for toleration, but also for recognition of sexual perversion amongst women. Carpenter, who had built a house in Derbyshire, which he continued to promote male homosexual emancipation right up until his death in 1928, wrote seeking to progress British attitudes towards male homosexuality. Quentin Crisp shows both the frisson and danger of queer love in the 1920s boarding schools as he regales a tale of an older boy sneaking in the middle of the night for a tryst with a younger boy, only to get caught, beaten, and then expelled. He then highlights the rigid class and sex distinctions present in the 1920s society, with the perpetual danger of same-sex relationships being discovered, giving them an edge, with the attitudes of law arbitrary and haphazard. Harry Daly outlines the complexity of queerness, class, education and employment, showing that as an out gay policeman he was allowed to continue his job while being in the orbit of the Bloomsbury set. Daly's narrative of the 1920s and 30s contrasts with Crisp, as while both were out, Crisp's explicit camp made him an obvious target for abuse and exclusion. Both men lived full and complex lives on different sides of the law, showing that there was not one single narrative for gay men during this period. As Captain R.R. Ramsbottom's personal diaries show, British anti-homosexual attitudes pervaded its institutions, such as the desire to root out homosexuality aboard Royal Naval vessels. To be a sailor was to risk arrest, detention and expulsion from the Navy if any homosexuality activity was found. A 1931 conference attended by the Director of Public Prosecution looked at homosexual activities soldiers might engage in and how such behaviour could be discouraged. Christopher Isherwood summed it up when he outlined that he was suffering from sexual inhibition due to British mores, and it was only escaping to Weimar Germany that allowed to see him what he was missing. 1931 saw the death of artist and art collector Charles de Susy Ricketts, whose love for Charles Hazelwood Shannon sparked a great artistic partnership, lifelong love affair. It is telling that in some renditions about their lives, they are mentioned as mere creative partners, though the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography lays out their love and Ricketts' tragic death helping pay for Shannon's medical bills. Queer lives may have been discreet and behind the scenes, but such love was possible. Quentin Crisp relays how hard it was to be visibly homosexual in 1933's London, as while society was stumbling through the sexual darkness, being outwardly gay made finding work and support from officials difficult. A June 1937 Times article outlined the pathologizing of homosexuality in men sentenced to indefinite confinement in a mental institution. Viscount Dawson of Penn showed the prevailing attitude in the 1937 debate, where he framed it as a foreign matter before the House of Lords and that homosexuality was pathology in need of a cure. In the same debate, the Times reported that homosexuality was a disease or misfortune which existed in men and women, hiding its head and impossible for spouses to know, and a tragedy once it was exposed. Crisp shows that in pre-war London, police tactics became grimmer, including the use of decoy police officers to seduce gay men, leading many to their legal doom. This turned fear of the police into being despised by homosexual men they targeted. The police targeted drag parties, queer clubs, pubs, and evening institutes which hosted queer events, with police arresting anyone in attendance. Crisp observed that his public camp persona irked those who camped in private and watched their step in public, as there was much hostility in society for what was perceived as an illness. Indeed, those gay men who lived incognito were ashamed of their identity, resentful that they could not live a mainstream life. Mark Weston, a trans male athlete, 1936 transition brought national headlines, not least because he was a successful female athlete in the run-up to the Berlin Olympics. He was able to change his legal sex and get married, settling down with his wife to a life of anonymity and normality. Weston and other trans men such as Michael Dillon and Ewan Forbes were able to get their legal sex changed in the UK, as one of the biggest fears they had was if they were in a relationship with a woman, it would be deemed invalid and illegal. Their cases draw out the complexities of sex and sexuality at law, especially as lesbian relationships were still considered unnatural. British law accommodated their identities, enabling them to live heteronormative lives. Britain at war again. As World War II broke out, Emma Vickers highlights how pre-war stereotypes and understandings of same-sex desires was reflected in the attitudes and behaviours of recruiters during the war. In the widest of senses, World War II represented an exceptionally important juncture in the history of queer Britain, a moment both in the transition and crystallisation. Quentin Crisp recounts his rejection by military doctors because he suffered from sexual perversion. It was a period when queer sexuality was variously comprehended as both acts and identities. With medical and criminological circles, understanding of same-sex desire oscillated between an innate and an incurable condition and an environmentally induced symptom of loneliness, fear and desperation. Jan Morris, in her autobiography Conundrum, lays out what it was like for a boy at a private school in wartime Britain. She talks of haylofts, intimacy, sex and desire, as well as the strict prefect-led discipline, which all left marks on her prior to her transition. Same-sex attraction and intimacy ran through the middle and upper classes in Britain, such as schools and the military, something Morris reminisces about fondly. For her, it was part affirmation, part discovery, her sexuality fluid, transgressive, yet also affirming. Yet, it all remained hidden in the haylofts and barns. The 1942 Kirby Kennedy defamation case highlights the social scandal of merely being called a lesbian, as Lady Kennedy was forced to pay £300 damages for calling Mrs. Kerr a lesbian on 2 occasions. Yet, as Elizabeth Reed Patterson Simpson lays out in her oral history, lesbians were common enough that women serving alongside each other would turn a blind eye to their relationships when they served with other women. A year later, in 1943, James Robbins was found guilty of indecently insulting a man, with the judge stating that he was a confirmed homosexual and he hoped Robbins received the recommended treatment which would give him a chance at life. In December 1943, John Horn was found guilty in Lichfield of sending indecent letters to a male soldier who was also court-martialed, though Horn denied being a homosexual due to being attached to a young woman. He was bound over to have treatment so he could live it down. Both cases highlight the pathologizing of gay men and the social stigma they faced from their convictions. The darkest of post-war days. The war in Europe ended on 8th of May 1945, and at 4:30 the following morning, John Barrington met a sailor in a pub. Big, tall and masculine. After an hour and a little persuasion, he and John ended up in John's office where intimacy ensued, and afterward the sailor walked off into the morning without looking back. Across town, a Conservative MP was celebrating with a playwright, whom he was having an affair with, a party frequented by people from Theatreland. Thus, peace was ushered in, and society began to go back to a semblance of normality. For queer men, it brought about renewed repression and a sense things were going to get worse. In the post-war period, any capacity for tolerance was lost, with no sense that any linear narratives can be traced of gradual opening up of social attitudes. The pathologizing of gay men was starkly laid bare in Charles Arthur Lovett Evans' 1947 report on the treatment of prisoners held in German concentration camps, which included the hormone treatment of homosexual prisoners. Rhodes scholar Eugene Burdick turned an acerbic eye towards the homosexuals during his time in Oxford, noting that times have changed and even in war's time, with the Oxford homosexual neither witty nor creatively eccentric, and the subtly homosexual youths who wander the quads carrying their teddy bears. In much the same manner, Douglas Raff complained about pansies who worked Leicester Square in London, going off with different men for a couple of hours. He archly described how homosexual vice was on the rise in London, and that police and social services must combat this evil new vice. Joseph Stanley weighs in, stating that the Manchester pubs monopolised by pansies and other homosexuals were bound to serve these people no matter how nauseating they may consider them. Such articles are common from the immediate post-war period, showing that gay men especially faced hostility in the tabloids and broadsheets. Slowly, post-World War II British society shifted from seeing gay men as a psychosexual pathology to a social phenomenon, no longer a social problem requiring a solution, but as members of a minority enjoying a distinctive way of life. This took 20 years to develop, which, as a 1949 parliamentary debate showed, the psychological and endocrinological aspects of homosexuality is being researched at 2 separate prisons, and homosexuals will also benefit from research, which is in progress into psychopathic personalities. In the post-war years, lesbians were still viewed as unnatural and subject to scrutiny by the military. This pathologizing extended to homosexual prisoners who were refused release if imposed cures failed to cure them of their homosexuality. In 1946, Dr. Eustace Cheshire promoted the unfounded ideology that if a boy child only has a father and no mother, they may develop abnormal sexual preferences such as homosexuality. This framing left a long shadow on gay men right up until the present day, with people questioning queer people's upbringings to see if that caused their sexuality. Peter Parker outlines how a thriving gay culture existed in London's West End, with soldiers and gay men convivially downing pints before heading back to rented rooms for various homosexual activities. These pubs, in turn, would then attract the occasional attention from the military police, leading to courts-martial and dishonourable discharge from the military. This overlap between the military and civilian queer scenes has implications for how homosexuality was viewed within society, with many of the later prominent cases involving both. It is also telling that the newspaper records picked up on military courts-martial more than civilian cases. In January 1947, appeal cases shows an early gay panic defence failing to be overturned for a murder conviction. Albert Sabin claimed his victim, Dr. Neil MacLeod, had propositioned him on the outskirts of Leeds, and Sabin had been so outraged as to fire his gun, killing his victim. Lord Chief Justice Goddard dismissed the appeal because they did not want to assume anything about the deceased, and that even if Dr. MacLeod had been homosexual, that would have no bearing on the defence. This case highlights the false premise of gay panic, and Sabin was executed 2 weeks later. However, a 1955 case involving 2 Royal Navy sailors showed that gay panic could downgrade a murder charge to manslaughter. James Bannigan was convicted of killing Norman Struthers with a microphone after Struthers had provoked him through sinister motives in taking Bannigan and a fellow sailor back to his flat. Unlike Sabin, Bannigan was only sentenced to 5 years in prison for cruelty in excess of the provocation. In December 1947, Lord Colwyn, a lieutenant in the Gordon Highlanders, was court-martialed and cashiered from the army due to acts of gross indecency involving Italian men overseas. He was described as a repressed homosexual, and though he had a wife and 2 children, was still told to seek treatment or continue to repress them for the sake of his family. 2 years later, Sidney Neal was convicted of blackmailing a man who stayed the night at his house by claiming he was a homosexual. The offence was taken seriously by the courts as it threatened to besmirch his victim's good name and character. Neal's homosexuality was treated as a medical issue, and his effeminate manner was seen as proof of this. Both cases illustrate the way, even into the 1950s, homosexuality was pathologised and treated as stigma. Even in prison, homosexual men were considered the worst of perverts, and criminologist Stanley Jackson complained that they should not be allowed to mix freely with other prisoners, instead ought to be segregated and given psychiatric treatment. A Blackpool police raid on a boarding house in 1949 brought about a slew of charges against proprietor Albert Catamol and many boarders, including men in the military and abroad. The police filed charges against the owner on the grounds that the house was being used as a reception for homosexuals, highlighting the dangers of using even private property for acts between consenting adults. The 1950 divorce case between Ursula and James Putnam centred on Ursula's affair with the nursemaid to their children, 18-year-old June West. It illustrates the social attitudes towards lesbian and bisexual women at the time, with the judge deciding that the pair's affair was grounds for a decree nisi based on cruelty towards the husband. The pair's letters were deemed pornographic material, and James alleged the pair had formed an association of an immoral nature which persisted against all his protests. Ursula's behaviour was clearly adulterous, though it is clear from the tone of the newspaper report that it is seen as both scandalous and salacious. A 1953 Mirror gossip column suggested that better educated women are more likely to be homosexuals, though this was amongst other pearls of wisdom from Dr. Kinsey, including stating it is a mystery why adolescent girls are slower than boys to develop sexual responsiveness. Female sexuality, including lesbians, was still being treated as gossip and salaciousness, a means to titter rather than as something to be seen as empowering and freeing. A Daily Mail article laid out the prevailing attitudes in 1953 when it stated that homosexual men were a grave security risk to the nation. A Harley Street doctor opined that there were two types of homosexual. The first was an unwitting victim of birth, as logical to outlaw him as it would be someone who was maimed or blind, pathologizing gay men. The second was a man who indulged his desire for sensation. These men made a choice and deserved all the penalties inflicted by an outraged society. This was followed by an article in 1955 stating that prison authorities should be given the power to release homosexuals early if they benefited from treatment in prison. Doctors recommended a treatment centre similar to Alcoholics Anonymous to treat homosexuals who had not yet fallen foul of the law and wanted to repress their urges. A December 1953 Economist article examined the relationship between the increase in convictions for homosexual offences, police attitudes towards persecuting offenders, and homosexual perversion of the young. The government felt that homosexuals were a danger to children, though the Economist stated that the public felt a distinction needed to be made between paedophilia and consenting adult sex in private. This draws together both the pathologising and the social understanding of gay men's experiences in the 1950s, leaving them at the mercy of a society with ingrained prejudices. January 1954 saw the trial of Lord Montague and two others relating to homosexuality in the RAF. Service members were subjected to 5-hour interrogation by RAF security, and during the trial the court raked over the private lives in intimate detail. Two airmen, Edward McNally and John Reynolds, received immunity in return for incriminating testimony and naming more than 20 other sexual partners, against whom no action was taken. The intent may have been to underline that social privilege offered no protection, or to reinforce the myth that homosexuality is inherently an aristocratic perversion or pastime. During the trial, one of the defendants, Peter Wildeblood, was amongst the first people in the UK to publicly state he was a homosexual. The Montague case, as it became known, was trigger for the Wolfenden Report, which eventually led to the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality in 1967. Wildeblood was the first writers to present and describe homosexuality as sexuality rather than a failure of sexuality, a rogue cheerfulness that is neither a confession nor pathologisation. Yet, on the 3rd of February 1954, the Under-Secretary of State for Air stated, "During the last 3 years, 86 members of the Royal Air Force have been convicted by court-martial of offences of this kind. This figure represents an average annual incidence of about 1 in 9,000. Sentences of up to 7 years imprisonment and discharge with ignominy were imposed, and only most exceptionally was a man allowed to remain in the service after conviction." In the previous day's debate, homosexuality was framed as a corruption needed to be prevented from entering the armed forces, and that merely asking questions about armed forces homosexuality was casting unwarranted aspersions upon the military. The 1953 courts-martial of Major James Calvert exemplifies the issue surrounding homosexuality in the military, with his conviction of gross indecency upheld on appeal, despite witnesses retracting their evidence. Britain was not ready to emancipate gay men and welcome in from the long dark night lesbians and bisexual women. Mr. Justice Linsky stated in his sentencing of Stanley Thomas for homosexual offences in 1953 that people must be taught that this sort of conduct cannot be tolerated, and is both bad for the individual and bad for the nation. That November, the Archbishop of Canterbury reiterated that the Church viewed homosexuality as a shameful vice and grievous sin, from which every deliverance ought to be sought, and that any legislation required a great many people to change their hearts. Such was the prevailing attitude that even in the 1950s, Oscar Wilde's grandson was warned by his mother to conveniently change the subject if asked if he was related to the disgraced writer. In the 1950s, teachers faced dismissal or forced resignation if they were caught for homosexual offences. The Sunday Mirror ran stories conflating the conviction of a male paedophile with the need to check every teacher against a list of convicted homosexuals. It showed that the moral panic over LGBTQI+ teachers date back to the 50s, while also tarring all gay male teachers as potential paedophiles. It made no effort to separate child sex abuse from being gay, and explicitly campaigned to get homosexual teachers, regardless of whether they had committed paedophilic acts or not, out of schools. This resulted in Henry Mountjoy resigning from his job at a prep school. Mountjoy, a convicted sex offender who had committed sex acts against minors, deserved to be sacked, yet the Mirror's crusade against homosexuality made no distinction between his crimes against children and his sexuality. In 1957, the UK government made it clear that any practising homosexual opened himself to blackmail and therefore posed an unacceptable security risk. This was in part due to the Burgess and Maclean spying scandal, which had rocked Britain in the 1950s, with both men being closeted homosexuals. Public opinion still weighed heavily against decriminalisation. Wolfenden to a measure of emancipation. In 1954, Sir John Wolfenden was tasked with chairing the Departmental Committee on Homosexual Offences and Prostitution, which in 1957 recommended that UK law should be changed to allow partial decriminalisation of certain homosexual offences. Daniel Brass highlights the complexities of negotiating homosexuality's illegality in the UK, with the 1958 run of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof forced to take place in a private members' theatre because the Lord Chamberlain's office would not allow it to be performed in a public theatre due to homosexual subtexts. A 1958 article in The Times commented on this, suggesting that homosexuals and lesbians on the London stage was a slippery slope that would lead to nothing but shock tactics and plays for bores. This was backed up by a 1951 request for clarification from the Lord Chamberlain's office to the Lord Chancellor's as to whether plays featuring homosexuality and lesbianism should be banned. No response was reported. A. Hildy Smith laid out to the UK government in 1960 that repeal of the Labouchere Amendment would stop blackmail and shift social attitudes from seeing homosexuality as abominable. The 1957 founding of the Homosexual Law Reform Society in the wake of the Wolfenden Report paved the way for a concerted campaign to decriminalise homosexuality in the UK. Its secretary, Anthony Gray, built support among Home Office officials, MPs and peers. He and his colleagues analysed crime statistics and case reports of blackmail and suicides, sent a digest of parliamentarians to highlight the harm being done by the law. Yet, after the Wolfenden Report was published in 1957, a majority of Daily Mirror readers disagreed that homosexuality ought to be permitted in private for over 21-year-olds. A year later, Lord Goddard rejected an appeal by Ronald Green for a 4-year jail sentence for homosexual offences, stating that life imprisonment was still the maximum sentence, and the appeal was rejected. Green's counsel stated that he realised that a sentence would need to be imposed due to the way society felt disgusted by such practices, but 4 years would degrade him to the point he would never recover. A 1959 Economist article lays out the complexities of overcoming this attitude, stating that liberals who wanted to implement the Wolfenden reform through Parliament would struggle even if they rejected the notion that any legalising law would make homosexuality moral in the eyes of society. It is telling that even the legalising of consensual sexual acts may not wash away the social stigma of being gay. E.M. Forster wrote in 1960, "What the public really loathes in homosexuality is not the thing itself, but having to think about it. If it could be slipped into our midst unnoticed, legalised overnight by decree in small print, there would be few protests. Unfortunately, it can only be legalised by Parliament, and members of Parliament are obliged to think or appear to think. Consequently, the Wolfenden recommendations will be indefinitely rejected. Police prosecutions will continue. As late as 1965, the Earl of Arran framed homosexuality in the House of Lords debate. What is homosexuality? What causes it? Answer: no one knows. Many have theories, but no one knows. Some people call it a disease, some people call it a diversion from the biological norm, others a weakness, others simply a vice. What is the cure? Again, my lords, no one knows. Some may even doubt whether a cure exists, at least in the extreme cases. That does not mean, of course, that we should not anxiously pursue our quest for an answer. Out of 1,065 men in prison in 1955 for homosexual offences, only 158 regarded as suitable for therapeutic treatment, and actually only 65 were treated. The Sexual Offences Act 1967 was passed on the 27th of July 1967, partially decriminalising male homosexuality, though not in the military. It was not until 2013 that same-sex marriage was legalised in the UK, and up until then, gay men and lesbians continued to live under a black shadow cast by the Labouchere Amendment. Those prosecuted, convicted and imprisoned under UK law for expressing their sexuality were punitively punished, unjustly denigrated and pathologised simply for being who they understood themselves to be. Times have moved on, but unless society remains mindful, that long, dark shadow may return.